Hi, Richard Nelson here with the Commonwealth Policy Center, and I am in the Russell office building with U.S. Senator Rand Paul, and we're going to talk about DOGE and an attempt to rein in the federal government from ridiculous overspending. Senator Paul, thank you for your time.
Glad to be with you.
So let's start with some of the absolutely absurd spending. And as I just mentioned before we started rolling film, I got angry just looking at some of the things the federal government was spending. I'm going to give it just a broad overview and touch on a few of the departments, different agencies, and some of the grants that they have underwritten. So the NIH had a grant, $740,000, examining social network among Black and Latino sexual minority men in New Jersey. The Secretary of Agriculture, Burke Rollins, tweeted out that she discovered a $397,000 grant in the San Francisco Bay Area to educate queer, trans, and BIPOC urban farmers and consumers about food justice and value-aligned markets. EPA Director Lee Zeldin.
You can't make this up. I mean, it's insane.
Now, people have criticized Elon Musk and DOGE, and they're questioning his credibility, but this is coming from agency heads. This is what they've discovered inside their budgets.
It would be even worse if you thought that this was brand new. If you thought, oh, well, we just discovered this and now everybody knows, so everybody will get rid of this. The modern movement to look at waste in government and to point out just crazy research that nobody in their right mind would support probably starts with William Proxmire in the early to mid 1970s. He used to do an award called the Golden Fleece Award. And the Golden Fleece Award, one of the first ones he gave an award to was $50,000 from the National Science Foundation to study what makes people happy. Another one, which is one of my favorites, is they wanted to discover what makes people more aggressive, gin or tequila. So you have to do an experiment, of course. And so they got half the codfish, and I don't know how you get codfish to drink gin, but half the codfish drank gin, the other half of the codfish drank tequila. And it pointed out what most people would tell you readily. Of course it's tequila. But I mean, just ridiculous kind of stuff like that went on. But the problem is pointing it out enough for 20 years. I've been pointing it out for 10 years. Yeah. Almost nothing that's coming out from DOGE is brand new. Almost nothing is out there that I've been pointing out for 10 years. But the point is this: if you want to get rid of waste, you have to reduce the amount of money you give to these agencies. Yeah.
Well,
and that's the rub.
Let's talk about that for a moment, because Florida Governor Ron DeSantis messaged out that he has been trying to return federal monies back to Washington, D.C. for a long time, almost $1 billion. And he couldn't do it. They weren't able to accept it for whatever reason, but he got on the phone with the DOGE team, with President Trump, and they figured out how to do that. $1 billion just like that he was not willing to spend in his state.
We return almost $1 million a year just from our office, from our legislative office. And there is some question whether it actually gets back to the Treasury or whether somebody else spends it somewhere else. But the bottom line is this: if we are waiting for a time in which angels are in charge of government, in which people are fiscally responsible, it will never happen. It isn't a matter of good or bad people. Yeah. I used to jokingly say, and still do sometimes, it's not a question of whether people in government are stupid, although it's a debatable question. It's really the improper incentives. Yeah. So if the National Science Foundation gets $5 billion a year and they're responsible for a lot of this crazy research, do rats use more cocaine if they're lonely rats versus well-socialized rats? And it is true, apparently, they'll use more cocaine. But it's like, that kind of study will only get less if we give the National Science Foundation less money. But since the time of William Proxmire, through my time here, despite my opposition, the curve on spending at the National Science Foundation does this. And 2 years ago, they doubled the amount of spending. In one fell swoop, they just doubled the spending. So if you keep giving these agencies more money, the waste will remain. So it's not just bad people, it's not just waste. It's the process of how much money we give to these agencies. You have to give them less money.
And it's the nature of government. Government will continue to grow and grow and make a case for giving more and more unless you make them justify that. And I think that's what we're seeing.
And the only way you become more frugal with your money is if I give you less. So if you have $1 million and I give you $900,000 next year, you've got 10% less. You got to make do with less. So you're going to have to, all right, what is the most important thing we do? We have to allocate our spending wisely. But people will only allocate their spending more wisely if you give them less money. But the history of spending around here is no agency has ever gotten less money. We don't even freeze spending. Every year, people get more and more and more. And as a result, the waste gets worse, not better.
Senator Paul, when you first ran for the U.S. Senate back in 2010, the federal debt was at just a little over $12 trillion. You ran on fiscal integrity, cutting back government to its constitutional role, looking for unnecessary and wasteful spending. Since then, the federal debt has tripled. It's over $36 trillion.
Despite my voting against every bit of the spending.
Not trying to pin the blame on you.
And despite my voting against all the debt. And what I've done over that time, though, is present things. So I've presented my own budget. My budget balances in 5 years, and it requires an across-the-board cut. When I first presented it, a freeze over 5 years would balance. Spending got worse. Then it was the penny plan, 1% cut. But as spending got worse in the last Trump administration and during the pandemic, we're up to a 6 penny plan. So you'd have to cut government 6% next year and the year after and the year after for 5 years in a row. If you cut it 6% a year, you eventually get to a balanced budget. But that's what it would take.
I want to talk about a specific thing in the floor speech that you proposed. This is back on February the 20th, and I'm going to quote. You said, "We only have enough to fund Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and food stamps. Everything else is borrowed. Maybe we should make able-bodied people go back to work. Maybe, for goodness sakes, food stamps shouldn't buy sugar drinks, chips, ding-dongs, and Twinkies." There was some applause when you said that. What kind of momentum is that with the Republican caucus? You've got 53 members, Republican members in the Senate. Right. Is there support for this idea? You're not talking about cutting food stamps entirely, just for unhealthy food.
We're actually not even talking about a proposal that cuts any dollars to food stamps. All it does is restrict unhealthy food from being eaten. And not one Democrat will support this. On the Republican side, we don't know, but I would suspect there's 4 or 5, and people know who they are, the 4 or 5 Republican senators who never vote to cut any spending and always resist Republican efforts to cut spending. That's the question. Will they restrict the bad food? You would think there would be people on the left. At one point in time in our country, the left probably was better representative of healthy eating and, overall health than the right was. The right seemed to be more concerned with numbers and balanced budgets and things. But it's interesting now, there's nobody on the left. I've tried over and over. I had talked to one senator in the hallway and said, all I'm asking is not to change the money. I would reduce some money. But if I want to try to get a Democrat, my proposal won't reduce money, just says you can't have sugared sodas, chips, snacks, ding-dongs, Twinkies, all this ultra-processed sugary food you couldn't get on food stamps. And I have yet to find a Democrat who will support it.
And you come at this from the perspective, of course, it's good health, but you're a doctor. Yeah. And you're looking at the overall health of where a government program is contributing to negative health outcomes. Let's talk about...
Number one problem in our country is obesity, and it's worse the poorer you are. There's more obesity in the poorest among us who are all on food stamps, and we're giving them our money. So, for example, people say, oh, you're going to restrict their choice. Well, it's not their money. It's our money. Yeah. We already do. You can't buy alcohol. You can't buy cigarettes, and nobody complains about that I know of. No cigarettes, no alcohol, because they're bad for you. You know what? Coke may be just as bad. Not just Coke. Let's say sugared sodas may be just as bad for the country, because what you get from that is diabetes. From the massive amount of obesity we have a diabetic epidemic.
We do. Senator Paul, one of the criticisms, again, of DOGE is that it needs statutory authorization to make certain cuts. Education funding is one. We found that the Department of Education is funding DEI, LGBT inclusion programs, a number of things that really doesn't contribute to good education outcomes for our children. You introduced a bill to eliminate, and I don't know if this is directly DOGE, but you introduced a bill to eliminate the Department of Education, right, which it appears that needs to be the route to go. What's the status of that?
It's a single sentence bill, and it was originated by this congressman from Texas, my father, years ago, one sentence. I actually remember as a kid going to the 1976 Republican convention between Ford and Reagan. The department wasn't developed till a couple years later. One of the things Reagan ran on in 1980 was running to get rid of the Department of Education. And yet he didn't, and it got bigger and bigger and bigger over time. But it's been mainstream and been a part of the Republican platform forever to get rid of the Department of Education. So it's one sentence, gets rid of it, and Thomas Massie has the counterpart in the House now. He took over my father's old bill, and it's what we really ought to do. The question becomes, Look, I love everything President Trump is doing, Elon Musk is doing through Doge and trying to get rid of waste and efficiency, letting go federal workers, downsizing, all that stuff's good. But it's transitory and in some ways maybe ephemeral and may not be real until it becomes codified by Congress. All the spending comes from us. So there is a debate what happens. So on foreign aid, Secretary Rubio has cut like $20 billion worth of contracts. I applaud him. I applaud the Trump administration. The question is, where does that money go? And it is a real debate. If it sits there, the Democrats argue it has to be spent somewhere else. Even if it's not going to go to the DEI program or the trans comic book in Peru or some other craziness, it has to go to something else. It can't go back to the Treasury. In the 70s, Nixon took that money and wanted to give it back to the Treasury, and they called it impoundment. The Congress passed a law and says you can't impound the money. Up until Nixon, though, from Washington all the way through Nixon, presidents would routinely send money back. And it seems to make sense because, like, if we give the president $1 billion to build an aircraft carrier, and let's say Elon Musk takes over and they build it for $800 million, there's $200 million left. What do? Just go to a party in Las Vegas or have a convention with $200 million?
Don't encourage them because
but they do that. They do stuff like that.
Yeah,
but really what it ought to do is it ought to go back to the Treasury. But it doesn't happen because of these laws. So this is all going to be debated. President Trump thinks it's unconstitutional, the Impoundment Act. It's never been challenged all the way to the Supreme Court. It probably will be. But that act also allows Congress to vote by simple majority to reduce spending. So Doge has found like maybe $140 billion, they say, in savings. What I did the other day is have the Senate vote on about $16 billion worth of foreign aid cuts that have occurred, but then that money would come back and be put into the Treasury. We got 27 Republicans and no Democrats. So 26 Republicans voted to keep the foreign aid with all the Democrats. So that really I got about 25% of the Senate. So it shows you what we're up against. This is the Doge 1.0, and it was to institute the Doge cuts on foreign aid, but I also wanted to see how the body would vote. Now, some of them said, oh, we can't do this, government will shut down, the House will have to come back. But many people in our caucus actually just like foreign aid. They don't want to reduce foreign aid. But here's my point, and this is the bigger point here. It's the low-hanging fruit. The trans opera in Colombia, who wouldn't be opposed to that? Right. $2 million for sex changes in Guatemala. Who wouldn't be opposed to that? But if you can't vote against that, how are you ever going to vote on entitlements, on reforming Medicaid and Medicare, and even Social Security? How are you going to vote on reforming those if you can't cut out the trans opera in Colombia? And that's the problem. We still have a number of Republicans who won't cut the low-hanging fruit of foreign aid, so are also unwilling to look at entitlements. And we're careening off of a cliff right now, borrowing $2 trillion a year, and it's getting worse. And so I'm a thorn in their side, both Republicans and Democrats, but I will continue to call for less spending.
At what point does fiscal mismanagement and a huge national debt, I believe it's about 14% of the federal budget services the national debt, and that's growing. At what point do the voters, or maybe Republicans here, say we've got to support what you're sponsoring and what you're leading? At what point?
I don't think the people that here will. You have to have new people, so voters have to become upset. I was elected here as part of the Tea Party revolution, and the Tea Party was people upset, people wanting to obey the Constitution again, balance the budget, limited government, not just get rid of waste, but make overall government smaller. And we did elect a few good people. Mike Lee and I came in on that. And since, though, it's sort of gone backwards and the establishment is now picking the candidates again, the real battle is in Republican primaries. Yeah. You got to pick somebody in the primary who is somebody who will cut spending and cut the size of government. But it probably goes on until either the electorate is angry enough or they destroy the currency. So right now, you talk about the debt payment. It's about $1 trillion. Yeah. $1 trillion a year going just to interest on the debt. It's the largest item in our budget now is interest. That just grows over time, and at some point in time, it crowds out all other spending. And at some point in time, you just have to print up so much money to keep up with the debt that the value goes away, and that's inflation. We had some of it during Biden. There's still some of it out there. And the question is, if we keep borrowing $2 trillion a year, we're going to get more inflation. I think we've got more inflation in store.
It's almost, and I would say, though, that the Trump election was maybe the second Tea Party election. The voters felt it in their pocketbook. The inflation hit them hard, and they said, this isn't working with the Democrats leading in Washington. And I hate for things to get worse, but it's almost like it has to hit the voters in their pocketbooks before they demand
I think
change
you're
from their
exactly
leaders.
right. The election was about that. It was about inflation and borrowing and getting rid of all this stuff. What I don't want to have happen, though, is in 6 months, people are going to go, gosh, I love Doge and I loved Elon Musk and I love what Trump was doing. How come the deficit's still 2 trillion? There's going to be this disconnect and voters are going to be unhappy. And that's why I continue to be the voice saying, love what Doge is doing, but let's make it law so those savings can be real.
I appreciate your leadership towards fiscal integrity and responsible spending. What would you tell the voters? We're going to wrap this up. I know you got another meeting to head to. What would you tell the voters back home in Kentucky to impact change up here? Their voice matters. Legislators listen to them. What would be a word of encouragement maybe as far as how they can impact change here in Washington, D.C.?
Elections matter. You got to get involved. I will tell you, and this sounds partisan, but it's frankly true, there are no Democrats in Washington who want to cut $1. So if we put forward, we're going to cut the $2 million for sex changes in Guatemala, no Democrat will vote for that. Now, they might vote to transfer the money somewhere else, but still spend it. We have this debate all the time. Can we not put it back in the treasury? Oh, no. It's been allocated. We got to spend it. So there's no Democrats for cutting spending, no Democrats for making government smaller, no Democrats for sending education back to the states and to the localities. So your choices really are, frankly, which is the best Republican. We're going to have an open Senate race. We're going to have 3 or 4 candidates running for the U.S. Senate, and it's a big deal, and people need to figure out. I'm not going to tell you who to vote for, but people have to figure it out. Who's the most sincere? Who will actually vote to cut spending? And that's where we make our choices. And once you get them, sometimes you have them for a long time. We had our last senator for 45 years. So people have to make that choice. But it's also in the primary, not as many people vote. So if you go out and vote, your vote is more important than the people who don't vote. You go out and knock on doors, you're 10 times more important. You actually give money and knock on doors and have candidates to your house. All those things matter. Elections matter. But this election for an open seat will be incredibly important. They don't come along very long. And for most Kentuckians, I think the choice will be on the Republican side because we've become a pretty Republican state. So I anticipate whoever wins the primary will win the fall.
Yeah, and I'll give a plug for the Commonwealth Policy Center voter guides because we will produce one for that U.S. Senate race in the primary, and we often will interview the candidates, and then again let voters know where they stand on the important issues. So, Senator Paul, I want to thank you again for your time and for your leadership here in the U.S. Senate.
Thanks for having me.
There's a proverb that says, when a land transgresses, it has many rulers, but with a man of understanding and knowledge, its stability will long continue. The idea here is that when people live without regard to their neighbors and without moral boundaries, then you need more government to restrain people who've gone off the rails. So if people are going to flourish, God's truth must be embraced. After all, God tells us who we are, what's our purpose, and how to live in harmony with our fellow man. Christians should understand what God's Word says and how to think biblically about the issues so that they can engage well. To stay up to date with what's going on in Kentucky, subscribe to CPC's newsletter. Go to CommonwealthPolicyCenter.org to subscribe, and you can also find other resources there. Thank you, and may God bless you. Welcome back to the Commonwealth Matters. I'm your host, Richard Nelson, and we are talking about Doge and the effort to roll back irresponsible government spending, the idea that government should live within its means, and really a lot of the discoveries that have been made about really utterly egregious grants, funding LGBT ideology, political activism, contracts that really have no accountability built into them. And if you listen to legacy news outlets, you are getting a totally different story. They're talking about process being violated. They're talking about the need for statutory authority to make cuts. But keep in mind that the executive power given to the president is wide. And also he has agency heads that review their budgets. And they do have the power in many cases to cancel grants, to revise budgets, and to rein in misappropriation of funds. And I'm going to share with you some of the things you're not hearing in legacy media by the cabinet heads. Here's a tweet that Secretary of Agriculture Brooke Rollins sent out the first week of March. She said this: USDA was funding a $600,000 grant to study the menstrual cycles in transgender men. I mentioned in the earlier part of the program that the USDA was funding almost a $400,000 grant in the San Francisco Bay Area to educate queer, trans, BIPOC urban farmers and consumers about food justice and values aligned markets. That's just under the Secretary of Agriculture. Uh, I wonder what the farmers are thinking about that. That's a lot of money used to promote political activism and foolishness. Look at what EPA Director Lee Zeldin tweeted out again in early March. He said this: I am canceling over 400 DEI and environmental justice grants across 9 grant programs totaling $1.7 billion, bringing the EPA's total savings to over $2 billion. Keep in mind that we are just a couple months into the Department of Government Efficiency's activities to see what the government has been spending your tax dollars on. This is the federal budget, and it's revealing to see what they're finding. Secretary of State Marco Rubio tweeted out that after a 6-week review, they are officially canceling 83% of the programs of the U.S. aid agency. He said this. This is actually a part of a statement that he tweeted. The 5,200 contracts that are now canceled spent tens of billions of dollars in ways that did not serve, and in some cases even harmed, the core national interests of the United States. In consultation with Congress, we intend the remaining 18% of programs we are keeping, approximately 1,000, to now be administered more effectively under the State Department. That was a tweet back on March the 10th. Let's look at the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth. He said that over $580 million in wasteful contracts and grants were terminated this week. That was the week of March the 22nd, including an HRIT development program called DCHRMS. I'm sorry, I do not know what that acronym stands for, but it's a IT program. It was a $280 million contract, which was, Hegseth said, 780% over budget and 5 years behind schedule with at least 2 months to go. And I don't know how many businesses are able to go 780% over budget and 5 years behind in the schedule. So Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth canceled that wasteful contract. That was his words. NASA is also in on cutting wasteful spending. They eliminated their unused purchasing cards. It was about 80% of their purchasing cards given to staff. They terminated $420 million in unneeded contracts, including $45 million to 3 separate consultants, all for change management support services. That's what they tweeted out on March the 21st. So we're seeing these various agency heads find serious waste, serious abuse in contracts, areas that they could be saving the taxpayer monies. And this is what they have messaged. Much of this has come out in the month of March. Social Security, one of the things that DOJ found. Now, you've heard a lot about Elon Musk and his team getting personal information. Well, they're authorized to do that. And it's actually for the sake of accountability and transparency. This is a report before DOJ even came on board. In July 2024, the Social Security Inspector General found that from fiscal year 2015 through 2022, the agency paid out $8.6 trillion in benefits. But within that same time period, 7 years, it included $71.8 billion in improper payments. Think about that, $71.8 billion in improper payments. Now, the majority of that went to overpayments. They were giving more money to recipients than those recipients deserved or should have received. Also, some of that money went to people who were deceased. They are investigating and will try to figure out what happened there. But that's a lot of money in inappropriate payments. Let's look at the IRS, misspending in grants and contracts at the IRS. Third week in March, Doge said that the IRS has the transaction volume of a mid-sized bank running similar infrastructure. Those banks typically have an operations and maintenance budget of approximately $20 million per year. The IRS has a $3.5 billion operations and maintenance budget, which doesn't include an additional $3.7 billion modernization budget. Think about that. Most mid-sized banks doing similar numbers of transactions, $20 million for operations and maintenance. The IRS has a $3.5 billion operations and maintenance budget. Again, Doge is finding egregious waste. Thanks for tuning in to the Commonwealth Matters, and we hope that you'll join us next time.